Next we have Suzanne Wilson.
Okay, so I have a simple job, which is to describe and explain the current state of teacher preparation in the country. So, yeah, that's not going to happen. But I am going to try to talk about this current landscape of teacher preparation in the U.S., working inside of the frame that Jack laid out, using language in a slightly, probably less careful way, but let's see what happens. This is a work in progress. So it's a sprawling landscape. There are lots of actors involved. There are lots of different ways that people approach teacher preparation. I think probably all of you are familiar with many of them. And we don't have a language or a way of talking about the landscape that allows us to figure out where the major lines, the major dimensions of importance are. So we, as Bob mentioned, alternative and traditional doesn't work. There's as much variability within as across. There's been an attempt to sort of push us away from just thinking about programs to thinking about pathways into teaching. But we don't have an easy way of talking about the field. So what I want to do, instead of trying to propose an easy way of talking about the field, is to look at lines of variation, lines along which things vary right now in the country, and see whether that gets us to a point of thinking about how to use Jack's eloquent remarks to understand the landscape. So I'm going to propose that we think about aims, approaches, and accountability as three dimensions. So aims, the United States is a country of multiple evolving and coexisting ideas about what teachers are. They're caregivers, they're deliverers of instruction, they're stewards of the disciplines, they're liberators, they're cultural representatives, advocates, professionals, activists, models of good people, heroines, heroes, civil servants, the list goes on. And it is completely inappropriate to think that you can sort of label a program as having one of these ideas or another. Programs embrace multiple views of what teachers need to be, but there are really different ways of thinking about the work of teaching and what it means to be a teacher. Learning a practice, learning to be a teacher, is not just about mastering a set of skills. It's also about taking on a role, taking on an identity. And that means that when we decide how to prepare teachers, we make a commitment to some view of the practice. We make a commitment to what we think it means to think like a teacher, to take on the identity of a teacher, to believe what teachers believe. So learning a practice is becoming part of a larger community of practice. But our school system in the United States right now, it has lots of different views of schooling in it. There are lots of different, the school system is a really different school system than it was 100 years ago. There's public and private, there's charters and choice, there are public choice and private choice, and within that system there are quite different views about what it means to school and educate children. And that explains part of the explosion of teacher preparation programs, because each distinct view of the practice of teaching and schooling requires a particular way of thinking about the preparation of teachers. And so if we're going to understand different programs, we need to understand that we have different views of practice and we have different aims in preparing teachers. Most of the discussion, though, is not necessarily around aims. Most of it's around approaches, because those approaches and accountability are the places where policy often thinks that it can solve the problem. So within approaches, which I consider to be organizing structures and program content, I'm going to talk about three lines of variation. And I use the language of problem here loosely. They're related to the dilemmas in some way. They may be problems. They may be related to dilemmas. I'm not there yet, but here's where I'm at. One of these lines of variation is the problem of knowledge and competence. A second one is the problem of learning in and from the field. And a third is the problem of the situated nature of teaching and learning to teach. So knowledge and competence. What special things do teachers need to know or be in the world in order to do the work well? This has been an age-old question that we have struggled with in this country. The Commonwealth Teacher Training Study identified, I think, like 80 traits. That was about competent teaching. The competency-based teacher preparation movement in the 60s and 70s identified lots and lots of lists of competencies. Michigan State had 1,500. And today we have similar efforts to try to figure out this competency knowledge problem, and in between the competency-based teacher preparation, and now we had Schulman's work in trying to map out the professional knowledge base of teaching. We had the explosion of standards, professional standards, trying to name what teachers know. And right now we have things like, as Jack mentioned, Lemov's Teach Like a Champion, trying to identify what's the core knowledge and technical core of the work. We have the efforts of teacher educators to identify high-leverage teaching practices. We have educator evaluation systems, Danielson, Marzano, other efforts that have sort of come from the teacher development, teacher evaluation world, been imported into this new age of evaluating teaching, and our lists of competencies, our lists of things that people look for when they're trying to decide whether or not someone's a good teacher. So the point here is that every program in this country, wherever you look, in addition to being oriented around a particular views of what it means to be a teacher, is that programs are oriented around a particular view of the necessary knowledge and competence. So we can't put programs in categories for aims, and we can't put them in categories for approaches, really, because there's a lot of variability across both of these, but it doesn't end there. So, in addition, in terms of approaches, programs struggle in terms of how to deal with the problem of learning in and from the field. This, too, is an age-old problem. Dewey's Laboratory School, micro-teaching, professional development schools, the use of case studies in teacher preparation. These were all attempts to try to figure out the problem of the fact that you have to learn how to teach in practice, but practice is noisy and hard, and so you have to figure out how to structure those experiences in the field so that people who are beginners can gradually take on this complicated practice-oriented work. And today, we have people trying to deal with alternative approaches to learning in and from the field. Teach for America it puts people in practice, and after very short training, the idea being that that learning in and from practice will happen and will also create the motivation and a receptive nest for acquiring more knowledge and skill, because the new teachers who are in their classrooms want to do right by the kids, and so they'll take these courses that are supposed to also beef up their professional knowledge and skill. Other projects are trying other kinds of ways to experiment with learning in and from the field. Bob Bain and Elizabeth Moji and their colleagues at the University of Michigan are trying the idea of rounds, where you structure experiences in very different ways than field experiences typically have been structured in teacher prep. There's the use of simulations. There's experiments with using avatars so that you can put, similar to kind of like the earlier hypermedia work, of using technology in order to put people as close as possible to practice but still keep it relatively controlled. So in approaches to solving the problem of teacher education right now, programs are experimenting with both the learning in and from the field and the issues of knowledge and competence. And then there's also variation within each one of these approaches around this issue of the situated nature of teaching and learning. So there's a long history, as Jack mentioned, in this country of grow your own teachers, and that had pros and cons, a lot of cons when you think about issues of equity. And today we have other kinds of ideas about how to situate teacher preparation in close to the situations in which people will be prepared. The whole idea of residencies and having teacher preparation programs be centrally located in school districts, staffed by school districts, and anchored in the specifics of that school district, including the curriculum and all the kinds of policies and practices that define districts, and getting to know particular communities, not some abstract notion of diversity, but the diversity that's in your particular community. The Long Beach Teacher Preparation Partnership is another example of an experimentation in trying to figure out how do you do high-quality teacher preparation by paying very close attention to the fact that when I learn how to teach, I have to learn how to teach a particular curriculum. I don't learn how to teach an abstract curriculum. I have to learn how to work in a particular school district with a particular set of students. And so this is another line of variation. So when you look at the panoply of teacher preparation efforts and efforts to improve teacher preparation in the country, these things do not fall into easy silos. Any one program can have variability along multiple dimensions just within approaches. So approaches in sum, one reason why it's problematic to try and sort programs and pathways is because each is working on these 3 lines of variation and other ones, the situated nature of teaching, learning in and from practice, specifying competence in different ways. And if we are to learn from them, we have to figure out how to look under the hood of whatever the label is, because, and I'll say on a later slide, it's not residencies, stupid. You know, it's not that you can't just say we're going to solve the problem with residencies. We have to say, well, residencies are a design that are, it's a guess about how to work on particular kinds of problems or dilemmas that teacher preparation faces, but we cannot solve the problem by just having a label. We have to have a way, a language, a set of concepts that help us get underneath the hood and try to figure out what it is that we can learn from this big experimentation that is constantly undergoing in the United States around teacher prep. So finally, the third line of variability is accountability. Here, too, there's a long history. Jack mentioned, gave us his oral reading of one such exam. I probably would have failed. Because I wasn't as oral then when I was a beginning teacher. There were public exams by visiting committees, local teacher examinations, teacher work samples, portfolios in various states, including, for instance, BEST, which was in Connecticut and highly regarded as an attempt to try to figure out how to do alternative performance assessment of teachers. And today we have the new versions of these things. We have EdTPA, which actually is based on a lot of the work that people learned about BEST in the 80s. In Connecticut, we have NOTE, which is the collaboration between TeachingWorks and ETS to try to figure out how to both take what's been learned about teacher assessments from the content, knowledge, and teaching work that Heather Hill and Deborah Ball and others have worked on to create multiple choice tests that get closer to practice, but also to use simulations and avatars to approximate performance and see how beginning teachers can demonstrate that they've mastered high leverage practices. And we have competency-based assessment systems. So here too, there's just enormous variability. So in sum, I haven't told you anything about how to understand the landscape of teacher preparation in any way that's going to help us say, so the best way to understand it is over here people are doing that, over here people are doing that, over here people are doing that. It's that people all over the place are working on multiple lines of variation at the same time. And these approaches, the things that they're working on are thorny problems. In some of them, I think that probably they're thorny because they are dilemmas that we're just destined to continue to try to repeat our efforts to understand them. And some might be problems where we can actually begin to solve some of them. I haven't figured out myself how to think about which ones of these are closer to our version of a dilemma and which ones are closer to a problem that actually we're getting closer to figuring out. Trying to sort particular programs into bins is probably, I believe, is going to obscure what it is that we can learn. The tendency in the discourse to do that, to use slogans, to dichotomize, to oversimplify, I think is the single worst thing that is happening to teacher preparation, because all these efforts to sort of improve the practice of teacher prep have a lot that they can teach us, but when it's oversimplified from the get-go, it's very hard to dig in and learn. I'm trained as a historian, so I, like Jack, believe that it might not be a bad idea to learn from past related work, and some innovation is not as informed by previous work as it might be. We don't want to repeat history, but it's probably a good idea to at least know that history. I think we need to focus on the right questions to avoid a horse rate mentality, what's better, what's worse, and that we need to focus on what we can learn from what goes on inside the labels. So this is my conclusion. This is where I'm at right now, the questions that I have. So I went to this great talk at ARA by an economist at Berkeley in the public policy school, Rutger Johnson. And he was talking about, have the federal investments in equal opportunity efforts to address equal opportunity in education paid off? And he started by saying, here are 5 myths, and then he went about debunking the myths. So an example myth was Head Start has failed. The thing that was very interesting about, among the many things that were interesting about this talk, was that he did something that Jack did, which was say, where does the story start? And when we're talking about teacher preparation and the state of teacher preparation, it might be a good idea to have a larger frame so that we can see the arc and not get misled by looking at a short frame. He also talked about the fact that understanding educational investments have to be understood alongside what other kinds of investments are being made. So he said, you can't understand desegregation in schools and the effects of desegregation in schools without also looking at the same time as what was happening in desegregation in the healthcare industry. That those things mutually fed one another, and there's an economic term for that, which I don't remember. But here's my point. Teacher preparation is happening in a landscape right now of lots of things that are happening in education more generally. Those things in education more generally are also set in a larger political, cultural, intellectual, economic context that feeds and shapes what's happening to education and teacher prep. And if we're going to understand what's happening in teacher preparation, we have to keep an eye on how it's situated in those larger social, intellectual, and economic trends. And if we're going to judge what's happening in teacher preparation, we have to not only have a long view, but we also have to have a systemic view that looks at what else is going on in the system, not just in teacher prep, but what else is going on in the system. So my 2 questions are, how can we use policy to nurture and sustain good teacher preparation? That's the question that often gets asked. But as a field, I think also we need to think about how we can use, and I don't actually think that we think about this that often, how can we use policy to nurture and sustain the field? That is, how do we use policies to allow for important work on these dimensions of variability, where people are doing really different things, but we set up the system so that we can learn from it, instead of just being in this parabolic universe where we're destined to repeat the past and not move forward. So those are my 2 questions, and thank you all for listening.